Okay, Shalom Aleichem, Reb Shnayer.
Lechem Shalom.
Aleichem Shalom, welcome. Nice to be talking,
Ah, wonderful.
always.
Yeah.
So, Reb Shnayer wrote this book. We have it here. How do you see it? Haaretz Asher Areka. And it's about Mitzvah Yishuv Eretz Yisroel. That's what it says on the cover. And we discussed that we should talk about it a little. So, I was thinking that you first present to us the main thesis of the book. What are the main chiddushim? And then we could talk about, I wrote you some comments years ago when it came out. It was only a year or two ago, right?
Something like that. 2 years ago.
2 years ago?
2 years and change. I'm bad at timing.
Okay. So, yeah, if you could represent, like, I was thinking maybe the question would be, there's a few different questions. You can answer them in sequence or separately. Like, one is that this book, like, has on its cover mitzvahs, Yishuv Eretz Yisroel, like, there's a sugya, like every other mitzvah. We learn in yeshiva, there's a lot of mitzvahs. There's Rishonim, Achronim, Gemuras, and so on. If you want to tell us, like, what is your big chiddush, or the main chiddush, or the main argument, or one of them, then I guess we would have to like argue in the sugya relative to that. Another way to ask the question, or another question, would be what is the main thesis that you have, or what is the main argument that you make, which, or really maybe a call to action relative to uh, the reality, political reality, or I don't know, Yiddish reality, um, something like that. And what was the third question? I forgot. But some another way of saying the same thing. Like, what would you say relative to what is the big chiddush to your book relative to like other political theologies, I guess, if that's correct, like context in which to put it. Yeah, and then we have the
Well,
like,
the Chiddush is okay. So the
yeah,
Chiddush is like this. I would say I like what you said, political theology, because in a certain sense, the big Chiddush of my approach here, which is why I find a lot of people have trouble understanding what's going on with the book and with me, is that it's a book of political theology. It's interesting you use that word because generally a book about a mitzvah, as you said, it says it on the cover, Mitzvah Yishuv Eretz Yisroel. So most people want to know, like this is the first question on everyone's mind: is it a mitzvah or not? Is it a chiyuv or not? Um, One of my big moves in the Sefer, and this is the first section which is dedicated to that question: is it a mitzvah or not? Is to say, let's stop thinking about choiv tour because just some background people don't know. There's a big machlokes if it's counted in the Tayag mitzvahs. The Ramban counts it, no one else does. Does that mean it's not a chiyuv? It is a chiyuv. People talk about this, and then there's people who say the halacha is like the Ramban. People say halacha is not like the Ramban. L'daiti, that's not what the return to Eretz Yisrael is not going to revolve around the question of do we or do we not paskin like a das yachid, which is going to be very debatable. Like just it's got to be more than that. And I see it more as like you said, really political theology, which is what I frame it in my first section, that we have to think about what the Torah wants from us in a much broader way. And if you engage with the Torah in a very deep and broad way, you see that Eretz is central to the Ratzon Hashem, and I mean that in the sense that the Jewish project, or what the project of the Torah is all about. And given that it's so central to what the project of the Torah is all about, therefore it's a mitzvah. I'll use that term mitzvah if that's interesting to people, and I'll put that on the cover. And I'm not the first one to say this. But more importantly, we should do it. It's the right thing to do if you want to live according to the Torah, if you're interested in the political theology of the Torah. So the last section of the book, I go into 7 sections, and the last section I go into what is the idea of Eretz Yisrael, why it's so important, and I consider that to be integral to the essential argument of the book, because it's not a book that's arguing for a very practical matter. It's a book that's arguing for a certain vision, which, getting back to the point I was saying before, a lot of people misunderstand. And of course, people ask me, "Oh, you wrote this book. How come you don't live in Eretz Yisrael?" And my answer is, if you ask that question, you don't know the book well enough. You also don't know me well enough. It's a funny question to ask, but in a very important way, a big aspect of that is that the book is an argument for a certain vision. And vision is not me, one person going to move there. Yeah, I want to move there in theory. More than in theory, I hope to move there. But that's not what this book is about. This book is about centering the idea of Eretz Yisrael into a religious practice and the religious sensibilities. And I'm trying to change that conversation and make people realize that it's all as a notion, the notion of a country, the notion of a political theology, of a political system that's rooted in theology is what the Torah is really all about. And we should all be embracing that. That's what I'm trying to do. And when I think once we do that, we're not going to be busy, yeah, mitzvah, nish mitzvah, yechiv, nachiv. We're going to understand that, like, oh, this is actually what Torah is about. This is what's interesting, and this is the most exciting and interesting thing to do. This is what Avram Avinu was trying to do a long time ago, and maybe we should pick up and do it again. And in between, we have a lot of other aspects in the middle, like what about the Shavuos? What about the fact that Hashem decreed we should be in Golos? How come people didn't go for all the Dairis? But that's the real book is the beginning and the end, where I say, look, the Kol Torah is about this, and here's why. Here's what's, here's what Torah wants us to do about it.
So would it be correct to say, like, if I add a few questions, one is like the framing of like a sugya of like halacha, and the other one was, or the last one thing I said was political theology thing. In one word, what your biggest chiddush is that the mitzvah is the political theology, or the political theology is the mitzvah.
Yeah. And I think, by the way, I think that's why it's actually one of the good answers. There's this big question why it's not counted as a mitzvah. No, there was two questions. Let's be clear. There's really two questions. One's like a technical question. The pasuk says such and such. How come the Rambam ignores that pasuk? But let's say there's no pasuk that says it's a mitzvah. Okay. But let's say it's still very important. So how come it's not a mitzvah? How come it's not a mitzvah? And I think a good answer, and I'm asking time of the Quran. I'm not asking Lom the Shakashis, Sefer Ikrim, why doesn't, I mean, the 14 Ikrim, the 14 Shavasha. I mean, a time of the Quran, why wouldn't God put this as a mitzvah if it's so important? And I think, it's actually a very good answer that this is what it's all about. It's like national identity, as a community, as a country, as a body politic is Eretz Yisrael. That's a mitzvah. It's not going to happen elsewhere. And maybe if it does happen elsewhere, it will be like it's Eretz Yisrael. The Torah is talking after that. It's like, Vayomer Hashem Avram lech lecha. If you're going to do that, okay, now we're going to create a Torah for you to make that work. So, you say political theology makes me think of Spinoza, who famously says there's no Torah. Torah is made for Eretz Yisrael, like the Ramban, right? Also says that. And I think I think it's pashtas. I think if you're honest about the Torah, that's the truth. So it's not going to be a mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael. It's like, okay, look, you're a nation, you have a country, you're doing something interesting, doing what Avram Avinu wanted to do to make this new society, new country, whatever, whole body politic with a certain vision. Okay, it turns downstream of that. You can't tell you to do that. You don't want to do that. Don't do that. Opt out.
Hmm.
It's up to you.
Okay, so let's, is there more, like, is that enough for me to reply, or you want me like give me more?
Yeah, if you think I'm wrong, then if you think
All
that
right.
something, huh?
No, we could talk about this, but like, is there something more that you want to like say that you claim something more specific or more interesting? I don't know, just to
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I
very
think
big thing.
right. I think part of this, related to this, is the notion that, like the other things that I spoke about, like sort of Shavuos and the fact that Hashem decreed we should be in Galus. I think in a certain way, all of those questions relate to this broader question because um, once you see that this is like Jewish destiny, and I don't mean that in like some predestined way. I mean like this is what the Jewish project is about, the Torah project is about. Once you understand it that way, then you view everything else in light of that. Meaning to say, let's say, um, you think about can we do it? Like, can we actually put this into effect? It becomes the most important question. It's not like a technical thing. In other words, people think, oh, let's say Satmar, we're not supposed to go back there so because Hashem decreed we should be in Gullus. Okay, so what's the answer to that? Fine, I talk about that in my Sefer. Like, is that true or not? But in a very important way, once you relate to this whole Yishuv Eretz Yisroel as something you want to do, and not like, a Heilig Gazach or a mitzvah, but push it something that draws you, then you think about everything else differently. And I don't mean the geas wise, because you want to do it, so you're just for everything else. I mean to say, like, you realize that this is what we're supposed to be doing, and this is what we're supposed to be shaya for. And Mamela, if you want to do it, then you can do it. Obviously, you could do it. Everything else becomes it becomes very odd the way other people are approaching it. Am I making any sense?
Yeah, yeah. This is a more particular Tana. Yeah.
Okay.
Um, yeah.
Meaning it
I'm
comes
just
back to the Mitzias as opposed to being, a sugya. It's like, what did I write the book for? The process of writing the book was like I discovered a Mitzias that became so obvious to me as a Mitzias that's like, what are you writing books and what are you arguing? What are you hacking Torah about? But then what does that tell you about Torah? That's why it was a very interesting process for me because it reframed my own understanding of what the Torah wants from us. And it wants us to relate to Mitzias in a certain way. It's directing us to relate to it in a certain way.
so maybe you want to tell like I know what you're talking about. I don't know if many other people who didn't read the book will know. Maybe you want to tell us a story, like what you thought. Is that something that happened? Like first you thought it's just a question of halacha, and then or like that's really already where you wanted to get, and this is just the way to
Okay.
get there. I don't know.
Oh
You
yeah.
can tell which
Yeah.
story you want.
Okay. The story is that for a long time I knew that this was important because everyone talks about it Israel. But I was a little bit I was raised in more of a um I gotta say anti-Zionist, like a bottom Zionism. So living in Israel was not the
A
center of it.
Zionist.
What? Yeah,
A
a
Zionist.
good. It certainly wasn't a focus, and the shuas, a little bit of a satmar by my tendencies. I naturally, I had a natural tendency to be opposed to a kind of religious politics in like a deep way. In fact, my natural tendencies were apolitical. Nonetheless, I knew that this was very important because whatever, there's all these chazals about it. So I started learning it, and this is what I discovered. I mean, it changed me in a fundamental way, not just regarding this particular issue, which changed me in a fundamental way. I realized everything's about nation building and country building, like the whole Torah is about that. But also, like this point I was saying, it changed the way I think about the whole Torah. The Torah became more about like Metzias, about how to live than about directives. I feel like you could explain what I'm saying better than I
Yeah,
could.
but
So I think I'm going to
is
let
this
you
really?
explain it.
I'm just curious. Now I'm just
Yeah.
curious. Is this like really what happened just from studying the Sugya of Yishuv Eretz Yisroel, or is like
Yeah.
because I'm
Yeah, no, it
sure
really
there's
did.
other sources for that kind of
No,
thought.
no, I think it really did. It really did. I really feel that there was a certain like quality of the Torah that completely eluded me because I wasn't engaging with it in a political way. And that once I did that, it's clicked and like it started making sense.
Hmm.
Yeah, so that is the story.
Wow, that's an interesting story, actually. Uh, so, so tell me what you want me to do. S-
I want to hear if you think I'm missing something, or if there's something that should be refined or maybe corrected. Did I go completely off here? That's what I'd like to
So,
hear.
hmm, well,
I know originally you had some serious criticisms about something about that point about how Torah's halacha and this is more like nevuah. Whatever you want to talk about,
right.
I'd like to hear. Whenever you had
So
time.
let's think of this. Um, well, firstly, like now after it's been 2 years that I read your book, I think two or three times the whole thing. So that's something that I haven't done for many books, contemporary books.
Okay.
Um,
I did the same for V'yoyel Moshe, by the way.
okay. No, I'm not reading it in the way that you read Vienna.
Okay.
I also read your the other books, but
Yeah.
not so
Okay.
seriously. I
Yeah.
very much I believe in reading people that are like my friends or at least somewhat have the same questions or the same problems. Like we should be reading them very seriously. Um, so that's one thing. Something interesting is that like after it's been 2 years now. Like you say, it says Tov Shin Pei Gimel here. So I'm assuming I also read it before it was published. I got a
Right.
copy.
Right.
So then I read it again after it was published, and I think even the third
I
time.
thank you in the introduction for your feedback, right? You gave me some feedback in the
Yeah, it is. And once I read it on the plane there to Israel, Turkey. So that was already th 2 or 3 years ago because
Yeah,
I
it's more than 2 years now. Yeah,
has to be 3 years ago already.
yeah, maybe.
Okay, so like what stayed with me from your Sefer. So this point, the first point, which is a very important point, we'll talk about it a little if we could. We don't have an infinite amount of time today. About this question of halacha and political theology, which is probably where the main important discussion is to talk about. Um, I don't. Hmm. It's interesting to me this thought that the thought that the story that you're saying that like the Torah became this kind of thing for you from studying this. I would have thought, or at least I think for myself, it's a much bigger problem. Like in other words, it's not a bigger problem, but like you can get to this from many other places to this sort of similar thing. Like at least the decentering of like machivosi ve'asena. That's one of the bad prushim in Masechta Sotah, right? Um, and um, so that's one thing. The thing that I actually learned was like the biggest, and then like your arguments about the Shavuos being about reality, these kinds of things. I think I don't know if I articulated, but I think they are like milsa de pshita for people that think of this subject in a real way. I don't think I think even the Satmar Rebbe sort of agrees with it. He just doesn't have the language to say it as that clearly and so on. I think that everyone really understands that. I mean, everyone. That should be pashut.
Kulam, kulam, like the Gemara says, kulam.
Yeah, it should be simple, like be real. It's not like a isser, it's a chiyuv. Yeah, of course, it's there's something deep going on with the medrash, but it's
Yeah,
for sure relating like that. I agree with that.
yeah,
So, but it wasn't like I can't say. I think that the thing that I mostly learned from your Sefer, and maybe I should have noted somewhere else, but I didn't, was this whole shot about chelik. I think it's chelik dalad and chelik hay, but these issues of there being opposition to Ezra Sefer, which is sort of the tradition of Talmud Bavli, all the way from the times of Ezra all the way to the times of Abai
right,
V'Rava, like
right,
maybe even later, all the way to the times of the Gaonim, maybe.
right,
That framing, you bring it out in like very clear sources and stuff.
right.
But that was something that actually was a big chiddush to me.
Yeah, and that has arguably there's a big parallel to that today. That's actually one thing that's
I
on my mind.
understand,
No, I'm saying that not for you. I know you know that.
you
But like,
also
the idea that Lakewood's a good thing and like, there's stuff going on in Eretz Yisrael that are challenging and maybe we should have this body that's able to sit and learn without thinking about any political matters is there's something there.
right, but
I
you
don't
give it
think
a
it's
very
correct. I don't think it's correct, but there's something there. There's an
you
argument.
give it a very serious history and like maybe even like it's sad. Like it's not, it doesn't come so clear. I mean, and you do have some theory that I don't remember what it is for why there's something like this and something like that, but it becomes a very serious sad. Like the shit to some
Yeah, but even that theory is only about reality ultimately. Let's
I understand.
right. No, so it's important. The point. Yeah.
Um, yeah, that's something that I actually learned from you very much, and I accepted it. Like I use it.
Yeah, you mentioned it once. I think you
I
wrote something about
mentioned
it
it
once.
once, yeah, and I'm pretty sure I mentioned it in other places, like in some in my writings. Not that a public place where I mentioned it. Yeah. Um. So that's something that I learned. So that's a part that everyone should read, Samazai, because you have to know this like background. I feel it's a very important history. Of course, all the way to the history of the Kuzri and the like that part I'm not so sure how clear the history of at least there seems to be more information that's probably missing, but like your framing of the 1,000 years and
Right.
the whole story, but that's I guess part of the same story in some sense.
I recently discovered, and this is something that I have to, if I do a second edition, this is one of the few changes I want to make. Not change, but an addition. I found a poem of Yuda Levi where he says it was supposed to be 1,000 years and what's going on? How come you didn't bring us back? And maybe we should forget about you, God, but we can't help it. We're going to keep pushing. I don't know if it's going to work or not. So he had an awareness, a self-awareness of this,
Mm.
of his place in history of this Hashkafa, which is remarkable.
Yeah, so that's important. Okay, and then that's that. I think that's the most the two most important things. The last part, just I'm just looking at the Sefer to go through it. The last part, and like some parts where you got into the Shari, I think it's also in the last part, which is like to explain the actual theory behind it, like without like the Aguda part, I least understood. I could say that. Uh, I mean, I know the sugyas, but I feel
You're
like
talking about the God of Eretz Yisrael itself?
yeah, the Shar
Okay.
Zion, all the things with
Zion, why do you misunderstand that?
that's a good question.
Okay.
I'm just saying.
I had the same question when I saw your notes at first because I know you said something. You made like some comment about that, and
I might have written that.
I sort of do understand that. I feel like it's part of what makes us very different, and I think it's interesting to if
Oh,
you could
so
articulate it, it would be very interesting to explore
mm,
that.
okay. But anyways, yeah. So firstly, that shtickle with the Shchach Mebuvel and all of that seems to me like very big chiddush. I don't know. Maybe you found it some before you says it. I'm sure, but
Not really. Let me just state it clearly for people because we didn't say
Yeah,
exactly.
tell us what we're talking about.
Yeah, so we're talking about that. Everyone knows that we hate the Bavliim. Like there's all these Gemaras, few Gemaras and Midrashim about all those nasty Bavliim. They didn't come back and buy a Sheni with Ezra, and maybe because of them, the Shechina didn't return it by a Sheni, and we always like to hate on them for that. There's Gemara and Yuma, Rish Lakish didn't want to talk to them, different places. And basically, in the Sefer, I sort of flipped the script and show that, okay, very nice. We're all upset at the Bavliim because why are we upset at them? Because only a Miyut came back with Ezra. Okay, Hastis, that Roiv people held, you should stay behind. Let's stop talking about it like an Avera. Avera is just something, a machlekes, and when the other guy is saying the wrong thing, right? The Ma'aseh machlekes. Not just the Roiv stayed behind, but the Chashuvim stayed behind. There were yeshivas in Bavel from Yechanya straight through, like you said, Talmud Bavli. The yeshivas in Bavel in the Goinim's times were proud of the fact that they had a tradition back from Yechanya, from Bayis Rishon, and the Bayis Rishon. These weren't, these weren't just the Amorats. And some Rishonim explicitly say the Chachamim stayed behind in Bavel. Yehuda Levi, he calls them the Chashuvim. He doesn't want to call them the Chachamim. Like, he deliberately doesn't call them. He's just like the elite. He makes them like the elite socially, but not in terms of Chachma. But of course, it goes together. The social elite is generally the educated, the intelligent, the leaders, and they stayed behind. So we have to take that position, take their position seriously. By the way, in Moshe, he does talk about that also. He
Uh,
didn't. Yeah, I mean,
his
I didn't
whole
get that.
Sefer is based on Rav Yehuda's Shir.
Right, right, right. But he also makes his point that like the guys who stayed behind a bubble, also had something to say. So what I showed in the Sefer was that there was a whole shita that said, look, we have these yeshivas in Bavel, they're doing great. You're going to go back to Eretz Yisrael under the Persians. So what's going to happen exactly? You can have a base on Mikdash. You're not really going to have political autonomy. But of course, there's always going to be some tensions with the ruling government because it is your homeland, and there are going to be people who are going to be pushing for political autonomy from Malchus. So it's always going to be rocky. This is sort of a prediction which came true. There was problems with the Greeks. There were problems with the Romans, which in Bavel, basically, at least in the way the Medrash puts it, everything was fine and nobody bothered the Jews. So they had the yeshivas, like people say today in America and elsewhere, like we just want to be left alone. We just want our yeshivas, and the government's fine with that. In Eretz Yisrael, it's always going to be much more volatile and much more tense. So there was this position that, yeah, you go back to Eretz Yisrael, it's all very nice, but the most important thing to do at least for now, when we're not having Geula Shlema, so Elamai go back to that soul for a quasi Geula, and because of that you're going to be sacrificing on the Torah, which is could be able to be studied in tranquility. Maybe a Miyat should go, and maybe people should stay behind. Maybe you need people to do both. But the community in Babel also has a very important role, and that role it relates to preservation of Torah. That's the very important theory of Chachmei Bavel, and I showed once you start looking from the perspective of Chachmei Bavel, there's other sources. There were Amoraim that held that way. Rav went from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, so Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish don't like the Bavlim, but Rav does. A lot of things fit into that idea, and I show also that has to do with the Shavuos. That the idea of the Shavuos is basically like is a Metzias matter, which is to say, don't go back to Eretz Yisrael if that's going to sacrifice lives, but also don't go back to Eretz Yisrael if it's going to sacrifice our spiritual mission. And spiritual mission, of course, Baker is Talmud Torah. And if we're going to sacrifice Talmud Torah, then listen, you can't have everything till the Gula Shlema, so don't try to push it. That's the basic notion. And we have to think about these things. And by the way, a bigger issue is something we spoke about privately a few times. It's maybe, this is probably a whole nother conversation. Is how do you think about these issues that are so far reaching, and it's hard to know what the ramifications of any decision you make are going to be. This is something that I struggle with till today. I'm not controlling world Jewry when I write my book. And that's partially why I could write my book. Like, if everyone would listen to my book and go to Soul, I don't know if I would say they should do that. Like, maybe we do need Jews in America. Maybe we need Jews in Lakewood. The only reason I can write my book is because it's not really going to be, not everyone's going to listen to it. Do I want everyone to listen to it? How do you think about these things, these big klal questions? And this gets to the point. If once we're doing political theology, I think this is part of your criticism also. We have to be Nevi'im, like we have to talk about the bigger picture. You can't just talk, you want to say Mechuyev take a lulav, Mechuyev take a lulav, very clear. We could do that without thinking about, well, what are the ramifications of this? Where do we want to go as a nation? How do we even know what we're going to do is going to affect where we go as a nation? But once you start thinking about the bigger picture, you have to have a theory of what's going to work and how, and we really know very little about you know, what the effects of any particular steps we're going to take are going to be like. And that's something very hard to predict. And that's why this whole notion of talking about what's right on a broader level is very fraught. And I struggle with that, like the possibility of having an answer to that.
Right. So that's so it seems to me that the biggest problem that I have, or that is there is, it's not just a problem that I have, is this playing on the two kinds of languages. So, I mean, the other people in this field. Like, maybe I should ask you such a question. You know of Kedushas Tzion, right? And and the like, people like that.
The
They're
organization
all,
in Israel, yeah.
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 Um, I don't know what other organizations there are in that vein. They're like the Haredi Zionist Mitzvah Yishuv Eretz Yisroel people. And could you distinguish some from them? Because their rhetoric is very much the thing that you start with, but then move away from. Like they're like, there's a mitzvah to do this, a mitzvah to do that, and it's shittas ramban, it's a machlik, it's a achra is like this, the achra is like that. At least, like the Tcheles people, okay, at least misafik you have to do it because things like
Right,
that.
right. Right.
And I think that's all it is, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So that is the difference. I am not focusing on that. I don't think that this objective will be achieved by those who focus on it in that way. Which is not to say they can't contribute, obviously, and maybe focusing on it as a mitzvah and as a suffix is helpful for some people and contributes. But I don't think that's how we're going to accomplish what the Torah wants from us. I think we have to think about it on a deeper level. I'm partial to these kinds of statements of, let's say, Bavel Keretz Yisrael, which the Gemara says. What do I have to say? I'm partial to it. Obviously, the Gemara says it, but what my point is like this: everyone knows when the Meshech Chochmah says Berlin is Yerushalayim, that's a negative. When the Gemara says Bavel Keretz Yisrael, everyone's okay with that. I'm partial to the notion that's what I want to explain what I mean. That if you have a place where Jews, as Jews, are doing politics as Torah politics, I have no problem with giving that Kedushas Eretz Yisrael. Like some of the anti-Zionist Haredim like to criticize or hate on Herzl because he was willing to take Uganda. You never heard this? See that he wasn't really coming from Kedushas Tzion. But it's shtusim because what's the Ma'ila of Eretz Yisrael? The Ma'ila of Eretz Yisrael is that the Jewish body, the Jewish nation, has autonomy and is able to do Jewish things, which is Torah things. If we could do that in Uganda, gesundheit.
Okay.
And by the way, technically, maybe it gets Kedushas Eretz Yisrael. Oh, but it's Kibush Yachid. Could you kavish another Eretz? But really, what does that tell us? And I mean, the Rambam says explicitly the Ma'ila of Eretz Yisrael is that there are Jews there doing Jewish things. Now, there's a reason why it's not going to happen in Uganda, and it didn't happen in Uganda. It's going to happen in Eretz Canaan, which is why I'm very into Eretz Canaan, partially because of the history, not because of some essential thing about it. That is we relate to it, we identify with that. It has the history of Judaism of Torah. It talks to us in certain ways, and that's where we're going to end up doing the Jewish thing. But ultimately, it's not about, it's about having a vision for a politics that's rooted in Torah. Now, that's not something that people are familiar with. They're familiar with mitzvahs and chiyuvim. So, Mamela, I think you have these people that something is talking to them about Eretz Yisrael. It has this ability to talk to people, but I think they're framing it, and Kedushas Tzion is part of this, they're framing it in a very limited way that doesn't really get to what it's about. And you have to be an Eretz Yisrael. I don't think you have to be an Eretz Yisrael for this, for what I'm talking about.
You do have to,
And,
but you
and
don't
Sam Rob's
theoretically.
busy with this, by the way. You know that. What?
You do have to, according to you, but you don't theoretically have to.
Right. But look. One of the things Sam Rebbe says, he says, look, the Gemara says, or the Medrash, it's not really a Gemara, but it's quoted as a Gemara in a few places, that Yisrael is going to spread to the whole earth in the future. What does that mean? That means that Eretz Yisrael is a notion that land could be sanctified by God. It could become godly. The realm of the human activity can be sanctified and divine. And that's something that's going to happen in the whole world. So he's basically says, we're doing that here. We're part of the process. We're being mitaher the avir of Eretz Amim. And what are you running to itself? Well, let it come here. I mean, whatever. He doesn't say it in so many words. But I'm saying I hear that. There's something there. It's much more important to understand the notion of Eretz than to be busy with the chiyuv, l'daiti. If it was an absolute chiyuv, I wouldn't say that. Fine, but I don't think it is. I think it's not supposed to be. So that's very different than people who are just not engaging with it on that level.
Hmm. Right. So let me. So this is like the first place where I get stuck, or where there's a question, which is how can you convince someone of something like that, right? So the thing that you start off with the halacha, like with the I think with Ramban mostly. Now this makes a lot of sense. Like, okay, so where does it make sense? Let's talk like this. It makes in Lakewood it makes a lot of sense, right? We have this like let's say more broadly Orthodox Jewish world. Orthodox Jewish world means it's also a political reality, right? It means people whose law is the Shulchan Aruch, right? That's what it means.
Mhm.
This is a good definition for Orthodox Jew. Um, and who are the like the who's the how's it called, the who's the judicial part of this law, who enforces this law? Not very clear, right? That's the thing that we're missing. It's more or less the poskim. They're the judges of this law. Although now we don't have like an official court system or centralization. We for sure don't have. But and this is why you can write a book, right? So you can be a lawyer for a certain argument, like if you write a halacha book, or let's say a halacha book, even like in a big important question, not just like a little halachas, you can like be a lawyer. You could write a law review article in favor of certain interpretation of the law, and this works, or at least has a chance of working, on these people who actually decide the law for the people, or for some people who decide the law for themselves, because they accept the authority of this law book, called the Torah, or called the Torah as interpreted by halacha uh, throughout the generations, and you're making an argument based on that, right? Um, that seems to be one something that works. How well does it work? How much does this cover even how the Orthodox people work? That's a serious question. But at least people do this. People write such books, and sometimes they get accepted. Even the Satmar Rebbe thinks that he's writing a halacha book, and people laugh at him for that. But there's not another way of making a Jewish argument that I know of. Like this is the thing that everyone accepts, and if you want to tell people to do something, that's what you have to do.
What do you mean there's not another way of making a Jewish argument? What about Musar and Machshava?
Okay.
That is also an
Very
argument.
good, very good, very good. So this is where what I personally like. People laugh at this, like the Chabinidov said that nice, I got the book, the Vayel Moshe or something. That's what people say that he said. Um, I find that to be very weird, because the problem of Jews, like besides for the problem that we don't have authority, like we're very decentralized, which has its good parts and bad parts, I guess. Um, the only thing we have, like when Rav Sadia said that "Enemas ene ima ela b'Torah," right? He was describing a reality. It's not ideal. Even that shtickle sort of makes it clear that it's not the ideal. But that's a different discussion. But the reality of the Gullahs, so the reality of the Orthodox part of the Jewish people, okay, is that we are the people who are subject to this law, and subjugation means really is only that we are the people whose only common interface is the language of this law. Because if you make arguments from Agada or from Machshava and Musar, that's a way to talk to people who are already uh, agree with you. If you're Satmar Chassid and you say the Satmar Rebbe said that this is the right Hashkafa, okay, that's an argument. If you're Lubavitch and you say the Lubavitch Rebbe said this is the right Hashkafa, and so on, there's no crosstalk. The Satmar Rebbe doesn't care at all what the Lubavitcher Rebbe thinks the right Hashkafa is, and the problem is not that he doesn't care. The point is that there isn't any way to make him care, because there isn't any shared authority or shared kind of argument or shared corpus or anything, which they or shared kind of sevuris even. Like it's just
But explain to me what you're saying, because a Satmar guy reads my book and he's impressed with the arguments. Doesn't that change something? What do you
yeah, it
mean?
does, because your book makes quasi halachic arguments at least. That's why you start off with halacha. I mean, Satmar, right?
I don't understand what you mean. This is very interesting to me. I discovered that this notion is central to Judaism. So let's say I discovered, let's say, everything you said so far about halacha, you didn't say the word Hashem. Okay. It doesn't need Hashem, right? There's
Sure.
halacha, there's a law. No. So it's very interesting. That's fine. I agree with you. But what if a person discovered this thing called Hashem, and he wants people to understand what's at the bottom of all halacha, or at the top, I should say, right? Okay. And he wrote a whole book explaining, oh, guys, we're doing halacha and it's really great. I discovered this thing called Hashem, and it changes everything. It changes how you think about halacha. How I'm going to give you the outline and let everyone study this, engage with this until they figure out what to do themselves. Okay. What's wrong with that happening? And obviously, where I'm going is I think I did the same thing, but I didn't discover Hashem. I discovered Eretz Yisrael, Kedushas Eretz Yisrael, or centrality of Eretz
Uh,
Yisrael to the whole project. And I want to just center that, put that back in its place, and make people realize, everything we're doing is really around that. And then maybe you're going to think differently about what's important and what you should do. So where does that not work? Where can that not work? I don't really understand that.
like, I don't think it can't work. Everything could work. Not only that could work. I mean, uh, non entirely secular arguments, let's say, could also work. Like the most minimal kind of Zionism, which is the kind of thing that Hertel tried to sell when he realized that he has to like have the minimal kind of thing that should apply to the most people, is just this idea of Hatzalas Nefashos, right? Of the Jewish people are endangered species, and they need to have a sanctuary where they could be less endangered.
Hmm.
Uh, that's a thought that can convince anyone because,
Right.
but why can it convince anyone? Because everyone wants to survive. Maybe even everyone that's Jewish wants to survive as a people, most people. Um, and if someone gives a plan, this is the best way, or okay, so everyone's going to listen to him. It's very hard not to listen to him. Um, they Now people have actually done that, you see. This is like the minimal, I forgot it has a name in like Zionism studies, like minimal kind of Zionism. And turns out that it's not enough for the Orthodox people. Um, Not enough in the sense of hmm, thinking. It doesn't actually convince them that this is a good thing to do, right? Might convince them that it's a needful thing, that you need it.
Mhm.
Um, Even the Satmar Rebbe could, like, he tries to argue that it's not really that, but he could be convinced that this is the best way to save the Jewish people.
Okay.
He's going to tell you that it's not, but the reason he tells you it's not is just because he's committed to the thought that it's not good, right?
Okay.
Um, and
Well,
people always
because
have this,
it's hard to disentangle and say it's good for Hatzos Nefashos, which is
right?
very
People
important, and still say it's not the goal of Judaism. It's hard to separate that.
Yeah, it's for sure hard for Jews and in general for people. Most people think that what is useful is also good. For some
Right.
reason, it's very hard to say
Hmm.
this is bad, but you're going to survive better by being bad or
Right.
something.
Right.
Like Scharva Einish, right? Yeah. Um,
What?
you need basic Scharva Einish. Everyone believes that what is good is also useful.
Okay. I see.
Basic human bias, or maybe if it's even
Good.
true. But
Right. And my book is about the good and not about the useful. But, but
I get it. I get it. I'm just
I'm turning
saying
out in the wrong direction, right?
this is
Hmm.
we're on a detour here. I'm just saying
Yeah.
that you could make arguments, for example, about what is useful, what is needed,
Hmm.
even, and people
Hmm.
could even agree with that just because
Hmm.
everyone is subject to need, and still say, but you're not doing a Jewish thing, right?
Hmm.
I
Sure.
don't care. And if you're like a real kanuya, like a real thing, you could say, I don't care. I'm gonna die because there's the chiyuv of gulas is mesiras nefesh. That's sort of
Right.
what the Viel Moshe tries to make that
Yeah.
argument.
Yeah. Basically. Yeah.
Um, and of course, it's a weird argument, but the reason he gets to this argument is because just saying this is how you're going to save people doesn't convince people. Why? Because their vision, their idea of what the good is, at least is mediated through. I don't know if it's entirely that, but it's at least always mediated through this language of mitzvahs, halacha. I
Right.
don't want to say the word halacha, maybe the word mitzvahs is a better word.
Hmm.
Um, Doing Torah mitzvahs.
Correct.
Um,
Right. So my book,
And
which is
this is
about
why the
Torah.
Satmar Rebbe really does that. And then I was thinking, okay, so is there a mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael? And he sort of comes to the conclusion, which is the same conclusion as you. It's only a mitzvah if it's good. And
Yeah.
because he thinks
Yeah. I
it's
know.
not good, turns out it's not a mitzvah, right?
Correct. Correct.
Uh,
Right. Difference is I'm arguing that it could be good. And then by the way, and I say this in the book that it could be he would even agree today. Okay, that's a different shmooze. You
but that's
probably
also
don't hold.
because of the same kind of bias where you can't have.
No, but okay, so 1 second. But I'm not writing a book about security. I'm writing a book about Torah. In other words, I'm saying like this. I'm telling the firm
Right.
guy who goes to shul and when the chazan, when the Bakaris reads the word Vayom Hashem Avram, he says Avraham, and he goes, well, Avram. So you should know, what are you being so makbid on? You're reading words of the Chumash. What's the Chumash telling you? This is what the Chumash is telling you. So I'm not doing something divorced from Torah, even if it's not halacha.
I agree 100%. I don't think that you're doing something divorced from Torah. I think that you're doing something that has a very hard time convincing people. It doesn't. I mean, of course, you sort of do also make halachic argument, but you are at least moida al emes that it's not really that. If you just do that, then like there's an API, right? There's like it's a like there's a common language which all Orthodox Jews speak. Now, the Zionist people just said this language doesn't lead to good results. We should skip it. And many other people have said that, like all the way back to Paul of But uh,
I'm Paul. Okay, no.
it's a
Yeah.
very old problem. This it's not a new. Not, when I say that, I just mean he noticed a problem, not whatever the solution. It's a
Okay,
very
but I'm
serious.
saying
What
what
I'm saying is, no, I'm not
no.
accusing you of that.
I
I'm just
know, I
saying
know, I
there's.
know. And I'm just saying Agoda. Like, why are you saying it's not an anti-halacha thing? I'm just saying
No,
Agoda
I
has a lot to
agree. I
teach
don't
us.
think
That's
you're
what I'm saying.
anti-halacha, but I do think
Right.
that someone, let's say it's like this, someone who, for example, and this is like the difference between you and Kedesh Tzion, right? Kedesh Tzion is only making halachic arguments, which is why they think in their head that they could, and that's true, and at least in some sense it's true, they could be convincing to any yid anywhere,
Right. Anyone who's not listening to them is not
any
being
from
authentic.
Jew.
Is not being authentic, right?
Now people could come up with excuses. We do the minhag, we don't care about halacha. Okay, let
Right.
me get out of halacha again. But
Right.
and I don't think that I'm not like here to praise this like uh, technocratic halacha and so on. What I'm praising is this common language, like praising it.
Hmm.
This is the part of it that I think
Yeah,
is
yeah, but
work.
isn't there a deeper language that underpins halacha? Isn't that the
There
common language?
is, but it's not common, unfortunately or fortunately. I don't know. Doesn't seem to work. I just see that it doesn't work. Like the Lubavitcher is also, you see, like most. Hmm, th this is a very serious question, like one of the like central questions in like people doing so-called Jewish thought. But for the most of Jewish history, and probably all the way back to when Rabbinic Judaism started, or at least where we know historically where we have the first records of it, is that the only kind of convincing arguments are the ones that work in the same language as halacha. Example, for maybe it used to be we used to
So
do medrash halacha, or you can do medrash.
right.
There's no distinction really between medrash haggadah and medrash halacha, but the point is that you're taking the psukim and
Uh-huh.
you're telling, well, this pasuk means this, or nowadays we don't do it with psukim, so we do it with gemuras. Okay, same idea, right? Um,
So I have a question though. I mean, you have the Hasidus movement or the Mussar movement, and they were successful in doing a lot. And maybe we could say the Rambamist movement. The Rambam wrote a book and made a lot of Rambamists. Maybe that's not quite a movement. So is there a possibility for there to be a Haaretz Shareka movement? And
yeah,
why
for sure,
not? No, no. So
sure.
maybe that's what I need to think about. Like, how do you make a movement? But why are you saying that nothing that like haven't there been changes that worked about things that are deeper or broader than halacha?
Yeah, for sure. This is precisely the problem with all these movements, that they're movements. Uh, the problem for me, meaning to say, all these movements, and if you really want, we don't want to do that, but if you want, you could broaden it to include other things. Um, were movements that made converts, right? In other words, Muslim movement, yeah, Muslim movement wasn't kind of a failure, but anyways, uh, Hasidus movement's a little bit more successful. All of these movements, they sort of drop the shared language, and this is why they keep on falling back into the shared language, right? Like if you really pro Hasidus, then you should still know that until this day, even the most radical Hasidic group still is swayed by halachic arguments. And in other words, you could be a Litvak from Litvak land and not know anything about the base, like the Ikra Emunah of Chassidus you don't believe in, and you say this is kosher, and the Chassidish guy, the most Kanyakish guy, is going to accept it or is going to take it seriously, right? Maybe you'll say, I have my own rabbi. Okay, that's a halachic argument.
Okay, and me and you, we're going to move to Etzrael, and we're going to do Areka, and we're both going to eat the same hechsher. So I don't understand.
Right,
You're not
right,
talking to you're not talking
right,
to the Zah.
right. No, but just that you can do it, but you can't convince someone, right? I'm just thinking of the convincing part, right? If you do it, like this is where I differentiate between like things that are good because they're done or they work because they were done, and when you're writing a book, right? Now, maybe you say that, like you said, writing a book isn't the point. You should just do things. Okay, that's the insight of
Hmm.
people like Ben Gurion. Like you just got to do things. Someone else will write the book to explain what I did. Ben Gurion's central insight, really Lenin's. But anyways, um, uh,
So I think you're saying is that a book has nothing to do with this. Is that what you're saying? Like, no, in other words, because people do become Zionists, right? And or they become excited about the notion of Israel in
people
a way that mirrors what I'm trying to do if it's not exactly what I'm believing in, right?
people become Zionists and all kinds. So no, maybe
Right.
what I'm saying this. Let's be real. What I'm trying to say really is that it doesn't convince me, at least in some moments of me, right? And which means, and not because I am open to many other languages besides for halachic language. Of course, I hear what you're saying and hear what many other people are saying. The When I say it doesn't convince me, in other words, hmm,
But I'd like to know why. And I
um,
actually, and I also have a theory why, if you want
so
me to
wait,
put my
okay.
theory.
So the first thing I claim is that there is a sheer Jewish. Now, when someone tells me the halacha is you're not allowed to eat bugs, it doesn't convince me either, but I'm still subject to that law. Like, as long as I'm part of this community or whatever, this is the law that we follow. And if you tell me
Okay.
I can find the heter, no problem, then I'm playing your game. I have a different
Okay.
roof,
Mhm.
or I could say, okay, I'm doing an Avaida. Okay, I'm still playing your game, right? I'm still in this language, like language game, like right in this. I'm still in
Okay.
this,
Yeah.
not
Yeah,
game
I
in the
get it.
sense.
Yeah.
I'm just so nobody should think I'm saying game in a derogatory sense.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
just like
yeah.
there's rules
Part of
of
the
how it
system, the
works,
legal system.
and there's a system. Very good. Now, if we take this out of the system, I think this is a big problem because firstly is that if you don't take it out of the system, I guess we'll stop here because, but like for this point, but first problem that I have is when you say, okay, but this is not really a halachic argument, then I say, okay, so therefore you're asking me to either believe you or not believe you, right?
Either be convinced or not. So tell me why you're not convinced. Like, I feel like you're
I
talking on a
feel
different
like
level.
we're splitting the word convinced. I would split it to the word converted, right? In the sense of there's two ways you can make an argument, right? One is the um, I don't know if it's authority. You could call it convinced, but one is the like, this is my idea, this is my picture. Do you like it? Something like that. In other words, that you converted to my way of thinking. The other one is by appealing to my way of thinking, right?
Mhm.
Now, when someone presents an halachic argument, or they're not saying, in some sense, they're saying that, but what the way it works is that they're saying you have a way of thinking, right? You say, even the most general sense, this book is the law we have to follow. Now,
Right.
according to you, we should do this, but you're
Right.
not doing that. You're saying, according to me, we should do this,
Okay.
which
Right. I see.
you present a nice case for why I should go according
Got
to
it.
me, but you're not
Okay.
talking according to you, but it's not according
Okay.
to me. Does
Okay.
that make
So
sense?
yeah, yeah, I hear you. I want to respond to that. I want to say I think there's a little bit of nuance over here. Um, Partially, I would say I would frame it this way. I discovered an idea that's amazing, and I want to share that idea with people. Idea meaning a way of living, a way of thinking. So that's secular in the sense that, okay, I can make it up. Maybe I made it up. If it's truly a good idea and we can understand it, then maybe people will be converted to it or be excited about it like I am. That's one aspect. That's not so much. That's why I said secular because it's that could exist regardless of our the authority of the Torah. But there's another layer here, which is not authority like halacha is, but it's close to that. And that is that if I show that this is what the Torah is really about, then I'm talking to the fact that you or someone like you is committed to living according to this order and form that the Torah gives to our thinking and to our religious thinking. And I'm looking to create a realization that I'm not being faithful to that form and to that order unless I embrace this way of thinking. So it's somewhat in between. I think we're going to say like three levels over here. There's halacha, where we know the language. As we said before, it doesn't even need, we don't have to talk about Hashem, we just talk about the law. And then we could talk about something in the other extreme, which is I discovered a good. A good could be obviously a material good and could be an intellectual good. Like I discovered a new way of thinking, and I think it's cool if we think this way, and let's all do it. And this is something in between because I think there is a much larger commitment to a way of thinking, which is represented by the Torah, that goes way beyond halacha. And I know from my own experience, what happened was I realized that I'm out of whack with the Torah unless I make this my center. Like every once in a while, I feel like a Yehuda Levi. Like, how could I live in Chutz La'aretz? Like, I'm just not a real Jew, and like it's a joke. I'm really am kovet avodah zarah, and like so this cool. And what am I even learning? If what am I reading the parasha? If I'm not doing this, like I'm just missing the whole thing. And that talks to me not because chiyuv, and not because it's a good, but because I am a Jew who lives under the order of Torah and makes that the central binding of all my thought. And that whole system has this central thing. And if I could bring that to people, I make them realize that they're not being fully committed to this Torah if they're not doing this. So you see, that's I think that's a little bit in
Okay,
between.
so right, very good. So, yeah. So I wonder if I could make like some kind of picture here. I don't know. I never. I could like this.
Oh,
Um, let's see if I could just
nice.
copy something here.
So put Ben Gurion in the corner.
I don't know who is gonna be able to see it or how this works. How do I type? You know, I could actually. Okay, so I just wanna put something like this. Okay, so if we use my model, right,
Yeah,
then we'll do pictures. So there's different kinds of arguments. Okay, there's one argument that appeals to what I'm calling you, really, the person you are talking to already thinks, and of course you're not saying what he already thinks because that then there would be nothing going on. What you're doing is saying that according to what he thinks, he should think something else, right? You're always
yeah,
adding something. Okay.
yeah.
Let's make it simple. Okay.
Hmm.
That's how halacha, that's how Socrates works, but that's a different discussion. But that's how halacha, for example, works. We're never telling. That's why, for example, like give you a psychological thing, right? That's why if you make this halachic argument, nobody feels attacked, right? If you go to even if you go to like a Ruv has a certain opinion, tell him, but how does it go in the in Milchus Kibbutz Avim? Limadetoni Rabbanish Kesef B'Torah, right? You have taught me that we go with the Torah. Now, what do you do with this source? Okay, so then you're appealing to that person's authority, so to speak. So nobody feels attacked. No, then we can have a discussion and
Right.
we convince each other. Okay. Um, there's the entire opposite, which is like how maybe what I call nevuah. I don't know if nevuah is a good word for this, but something like where someone comes and says you could call it entirely secular, but I don't know if that's the correct word. Something like this is what I think, this is my way of life, whatever it is. Do you like it, or do you accept it, or do you accept me? Like this is the difference between a Rov and a Rebbe, right? This is why a Rebbe you
Yeah.
either accept or you don't. Either you believe or you don't. There isn't the question of do you believe the Rov. We already believe the thing that he works, and the question is,
Yeah.
did he judge this case correctly according to the
Right.
sources that we all agree?
Yeah, and just to put a stop up in right there, I think this gets to a certain tension, and this is sort of what we're talking about, which is that why am I writing a book? Meaning, if I would go ahead and do something, for that kind of movement of like, okay, this is what I believe in, this was interesting to me, that's generally expressed through action more than books. And even the books that are written in a very different way. Like it's part of a movement, it's propaganda, whatever. I am doing something in between over here. This is, I think, this is your in between. We're getting to that?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And we even get to the question, which is what I wanted to get to, which is
Ah,
like, isn't there some kind of archivia right? Uh, aren't you like trying to do make one? I don't know how to write
put
this,
the T, switch the T and the C there. Yeah. Okay.
right? Aren't you telling like because in the one when you start writing a book, like this is what the title says, and then switch to telling me, no, I'm not here in the name of like the interpretation of Allah or a mitzvah. I'm here in the name of what the good really is, and of course, then I get right. Of course, you say that that's what the title means, but
Right. So the
there's
good really is assuming you want to take the form and
right,
order of the
right,
Torah.
very good.
That's
It's very good. So here we arrived at something useful. Um, and then now I have to think if I think that this in between thing works.
hmm
Um, I do. I definitely think the two side things work.
hmm
Um, so for example, so the middle thing is the hardest thing. Like and you could probably say that
No,
many
but
people.
you see, one second, you see why I brought up before that, like, I personally find myself sometimes with that tension that I'm not living according to that order of the Torah. And that's where I want to show you that I think it does work because we learn Torah
Right.
so that it affects us in various ways more than halacha. It affects us because if we get to the point where we realize us and the Torah don't stem, we have two choices. Either we stop learning Torah or we somehow change. And that change, I think, is a good.
Right. So. I get it. I get it. I feel like this comes to a very general, like kind of problem. Um, let's first try to think of it in a more restricted sense. So, first question is, does this work, right? Let's say, does it historically work? Like we think of these analogies of different movements. Does it work to say you are committed to the Torah, but your Torah doesn't make sense? Something like that is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Therefore, or I could prove you internally that it's internally inconsistent somehow. And
Right.
therefore,
And once you realize that, you're going to come learn by me for a year until you understand what the
and
Torah
you
is
will
really
look,
saying, and then you're going to become a good Zionist, among other things. Among other things.
yes, exactly. I feel like historically, this kind of argument is something that many people have tried to make, and it only works when you make it into halacha. Like if we take the example of the Rambam, um, like in some sense, this is the framing of the Moreh Nevuchim, right? You believe you're committed to the Torah, but the Torah literally says things that are wrong. Therefore, you have to accept my interpretation of the Torah, which is that the Torah is not literal. Some parts of it, God doesn't have a body. Okay. Now, there's very famously like this logical inconsistency was discovered by many people. Like it, like if
No,
why would
but one second. But you're talking about whether the Torah contradicts something external to the Torah. I'm
okay.
saying over here.
Yeah, but it's a similar kind of problem. I understand. You could make, but the Rambam does make internal arguments. Like there's another pasuk that says God doesn't have a body and so on.
Okay. Okay.
There
I
are
see.
internal arguments. It's true that there
Right.
are
Right.
external arguments.
Okay.
Um, why do people? I think that historically this didn't work very well. I don't know if for correct. Maybe I don't know if it's right that it didn't work very well. Could be that it's just I could take off my thing, right? It could be that it's just does it get saved if I take it away? Could be that it's just because people are dumb or something, but it doesn't work because for the most part you get people saying things like this. Okay, so why don't I can just choose one of these. People are pretty in reality, people are happy to choose one of these. Even when you present them with this contradiction, they like the Rambam presents this like either you're dumb and you believe or you're smart and you disbelieve. And I discovered a smart way to believe, right? That's the Rambam's thing. But most people just say, you know what, I'll just be dumb and believe. The from people. The non from people just say, I'll just be smart and not believe. I don't need your thanks for your services. We don't need your help. And it's what's the argument against those people, right? Uh, do you have an argument
Well,
against something like
both of
that?
them are not. I understand. I mean, aren't don't people want to live under the order of the Torah? I'm very
Yeah, but
confused.
they
I'm
seem
very
to be.
confused about what you're
Yeah,
describing
but
here.
they look at the people. They seem to be happy with saying we don't understand. The Torah says he should do this and shine. Does it? Yeah, the Torah also says you should go in Etzisrael. Okay, it's schwer sugya. I don't know. Learn in Megillah Esther. You'll find out. Whatever. Doesn't look like people are very, very worried about this. Maybe I
I think
am,
it's
but
interesting
most
because are
people are.
Yechidim that are? See, that's an
Yeah.
interesting question because I think the Yechidim are. I have discovered Yechidim through my writing. There are
Hmm.
Yechidim that do think about it, including myself. So I'm writing for people like me, like you. And does that have an effect? I think it does.
Yeah. Some people are. Um, but when you get to people like me, then I'm just like I don't know if this is an argument. Maybe I'm just using those people to say like, but you didn't convince the part of me that thought this to reconcile with the part of me that thought that, right?
Right. So that's what I'd like to understand. What about it didn't convince you? Like I said, I have a theory, but I want to hear.
Tell me your theory, and we can jump to your theory.
Well, my theory relates to this notion of the order of the Torah. I think we think of it very differently. Um, I think I am more of a believer in let's say an originalist, as it were, like more into Tanakh. I think this has to do with why the seventh section didn't speak to you. I think that in order for us to live under an order that will actually work for us at a national religious slash national level, I mean religious national together, we have to go back to the Torah in its original meaning and I think this is a little bit of an ongoing question to me and you, whether that's possible. I believe that's possible. That's what's my other books demonstrate more than this one even, that like we really have to re-embrace the Torah on its own terms. And again, A, that we can do that, and B, that will be the only way we'll ever have a unified order and form as a nation, because that is ultimately what unites us as the book. While I think that you think about this differently and you are more accepting or open to the idea that things have changed and there's a different approach to Torah, that doesn't have to go back to the original Torah. Does this mean anything to you? Okay, do you
Hmm.
think I'm onto something or what?
Um, I
By
don't
the
know.
way, by the way, I learned, maybe you knew this, but someone told me after I published the book, someone sent me, I always thought that like for basically 1,000 years till Yehuda Levi, nobody was calling to go back to Eretz Yisrael. And that's I wrote about the 1,000 years after the Churban, and all of a sudden you have this book saying, let's go back to Eretz Yisrael, remarkable historical development. But I learned that the Karoim were busy with
You're making my argument for me now,
Okay,
right?
I know. I have no problem making your argument, and I have no problem being honest,
Yeah.
as you
The
know.
and
Um,
and
that's the
possibly
thing.
that Gemara in Bava Kama, or is it, well, At Chashivas L'Saba al Yerushalayim is about someone who, some
Uh,
proto-Karoi kind of person.
Interesting. Elazar or whatever. He had a funny
Yeah.
name, right? We didn't know him from elsewhere. I was wondering, right?
Maybe he
Elazar
was a
Zahira?
Karoi.
No, Elazar
Yeah, I
was.
think so. Something like that.
Yeah, I
Ah,
have a Gemara right here.
jeez. I have everything here. L'Saba.
Um, yes, that is very interesting. That is a very interesting question to me, and then maybe that's the Eliezer Zahira. Eliezer the Small.
Hmm. We don't
Yeah,
know
who
who
is
that,
he?
we don't know who that is.
I don't know. Who
Interesting.
is he? Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting. He was the first Zionist that was told
Yeah,
by the
yeah, yeah,
rabbis
yeah.
that it's
They had a
not.
name, the Karaim. You know what the name was?
Yeah, Avela Tzion or something
Yeah,
like
yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah. So I feel it's yeah. I really
Something.
should.
Um,
Yeah.
so and they actually it's not only that, there's still a Karo Yishuv, a continuous Yishuv in Yerushalayim since then.
Yeah, yeah. Look, yeah, I know. And I mean, my argument is that Yehuda Levi's Judaism ultimately has to win out. And essentially, that's, sort of what the point is, that a Judaism that the only one that will ultimately win out is one that really embraces the Tanakh on its own terms.
Yeah, yeah. So
That's at the root of this whole schmooze.
I don't know. I don't know to what. Maybe this is true, but only as a like a result. I'm not sure that this is the source. Like I also don't know if you are such an originalist like yourself. I think maybe it's just an argument that you're making. I'm not sure.
I know we have to listen. The
The
only way
same
to work
question.
that out, I think, is to take a text that I've written or something, and I'll show you why I think I'm original. I don't think we can talk about this in the abstract. I
No,
think I
I
am.
don't. I don't disagree that you make originalist kind of arguments, but I don't know if like you're real. Like even when you say that this is the solution to a problem, right? So the problem is what's motivating you, and then you say, well, I discovered this thing, this book called Tanakh, and it has a solution. You're not saying like it doesn't start because then you're back in like the Christian kind of people. Like, okay,
Why?
a little
No.
broader. No, it's broader because they're just saying halacha, and you're saying there's a story also. Like there's that's the story, but you're still saying your argument still becomes like from the authority of the Torah.
But I
And
think my argument, right? Exactly. No, but that's what I'm trying to answer you. That my argument does appeal to something that people are accepting. I'm not coming from. That's exactly my point. That I
I
am making an argument
understand.
that it's appealing to something that's pre-existing my argument.
Right, right. But so my so look, wow. So what time are we in? So one very general comment that I have on your whole everything that you do. No, I'm just gonna say this. No, maybe it's gonna help us here. Is
Okay.
that all arguments can be had on all levels. I don't really find anything gets solved this way. In other words, and I think this is something that maybe it's on purpose. We once discussed this in one of your things that you wrote, maybe about Yosef Atzadik. Um, Most people, for example, that read you, and this is a problem that I have not only with you, but with like all Jewish writings ever, uh, don't. So it's not personal.
Yeah, yeah, no,
Most
let me hear.
people
I'm so
think
excited to hear.
that
What?
most people think that the like raya or the proof text that you're bringing is what's really motivating you. But in
Okay.
some sense, what you're saying is that the proof text had the same problem that you had, and is solving it in a way that you accept.
Okay. No, but that's where the order comes in. But we are committed to the proof text already. So
I understand, but I'm just saying. So which means, but this what this means is now people like me and you, Baruch Hashem, we learned enough Chumash and Medrash and everything. I think that I can make every argument if like you can even go back all the way to like the first kind of Jewish arguments, which are Midrash Halacha, right? Uh, you can. This is why also I think that like people like the Rambam who claim that the Chachamim were really philosophers just speaking a different language have a very good point. Like that's possibly true. Unlike what other people were just looking at the language and say, no, they're speaking a different language, just the eyes from Sukkim. So they must be just people who believe that all truth inheres in this book and that's where it starts and begins. I was like, no. Well, of course they believe that this book revealed the truth, but it doesn't mean that when they're having a proof that it's not just a different way of saying the same argument that someone else would have maybe from in a different language or from other sources. And
Hmm.
this is actually why you could learn the Torah, right? Because it's
Well,
not.
yes, but there's an element here that you're understating, I think, which is that there are philosophical arguments such as they are only are informed by the fact that there's a text and are working with the fact that there's a text. Text is not just there to hang it on. It's the
No, I
philosophy
don't think
is
it's
that it's
hanging it
good to live
on.
under a text. And
It's
this
not.
text.
I get it. I don't think it's hanging on, but the point that I do take from this is that, in other words, probably if I say an argument from I don't know, let's say now I'm taking a totally different question because let's say someone comes and says. Uh, this thing that happened, some specific event, is a good thing because there's a pasuk that says that when something like this will happen, it will be good. Okay, and he shows you the pasuk, and it really means that, or it's a gematria, that doesn't matter. And then I tell him, I think it's not good because it has results of this kind, and because of this and that. And then the person answers me, "What do you mean? You're arguing with the pasuk, right?" And usually I stop the conversation at that point because it's probably not going to get anywhere. But the truth would be that number one, uh, what I am telling, I could find the pasuk too, not fakely, truly. In other words, when I say this thing that has a good part has a bad, has I think it's bad, and the so on. There's a pasuk for that, and there's a pasuk that really says that, not just that I'm making a smachta. There's a pasuk that really says that.
So you're denying the possibility of
Um,
originalist reading, aren't you?
Not sure. And or in the same way, we could go backwards, right? What you're claiming that it's good is also because you think it's good, besides for the fact that you think it's so. The whole conversation can be had on both levels, and I don't know how much of a big difference it makes. Um,
Both levels explain. I don't know what you mean by that. You said it could be
Meaning
on both
the
levels.
sort like the non-Pusik level and the Pusik level.
Okay.
The they
Mhm.
you could have I'm pretty sure that you could translate almost every like if you learn
Mhm.
halacha you could see that this is very obvious, okay?
Oh, I
There's
see what you're
one
saying.
machlokes in halacha where Bashamai says I have a pasuk, Basil says you have a pasuk, which can't also be explained by Bashamai has a svara and Basil has a svara.
Okay, can I say something on that? Let me say something on to that, which because I don't want to
Okay.
forget this. I got to interrupt you because I think this might be very interesting. Here's a way to think about it, and I think maybe this is what I really believe. Yes, the conversation we have on the non-Pusik level. Okay, if I were to have this conversation on my Sefer on the non-Pusik level, nobody would listen to me, obviously, right? There wouldn't be anything to talk about.
No.
So guess what? No. So guess what? The psukim are very important because the psukim are what allow me to talk to people in a language that's working on a lower level, right? And talk about this. However, unlike what you're saying, I don't think that it's infinitely malleable. I think the Torah is there to reflect the one truth that I discovered. And Baruch Hashem, we
First
can read
limit.
into the Torah properly. So that's I'm saying as long as you accept that you
I'm not
can't.
claiming that it's infinitely malleable. The Torah has
So
limits, and maybe they're the same limits as reason. I don't know. Everything has limit. In other words, it's organized in some way. It's not like
right,
you can make a gematria out of everything, but we're thinking at something that has some
right,
point. Even
compelling, whatever,
and
something
by the
that
way, even gematria has limits. People don't know this, but it's math. You can't make one gematria two. Even a coil only changes one to zero, doesn't change it to two.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and
Okay.
no, anyways, um, so my more important argument is that the place where originalist arguments don't work is when it becomes this rhetoric where you're just saying a svara and I'm saying a pasuk. Now it might be my choice, maybe it's a wrong choice to speak in the name of a svara and your choice to speak in the name of a pasuk, but we're really having uh, we could we could really do both. We could really, it doesn't solve the issue. right?
I know, but the pasuk serves as a limit on the svara, and
Yeah,
unless you say
yeah,
it's
and we
available.
could I could tell you myself the limit of the svara without the pasuk, right? Or with the pasuk, doesn't matter.
I
Which
think you're
means
saying that you're as smart as the Navi is, which
I
but if
don't
you're
know.
not,
No,
if
maybe
you're not, then you
not.
need to
Maybe yes,
trust
maybe
it.
not. Well, that's a
Right, but
different
no, if
question.
you want to say that, fine. But otherwise, you're saying you understand the Torah so
I
well that you
understand.
could talk the Torah language without the words of Torah. Fine, I accept that. I have no
I
problem
don't.
with
I
that.
don't say that. I
But then the Torah does
mostly
help
claim to
is
be able to do
helpful.
the opposite. That I could speak
What?
what like you're saying. I could speak what I think in the Torah language, right?
That's what I think
That
about
would be
you.
the claim.
That's what I think about you. That's my opinion about you. But then it's helpful for me to say, wait a second, Rabbi Yitzchok, you're saying X, Y, Z, but I found the pasuk somewhere that says fakir. That's helpful because I don't accept
I
you
didn't
as
say it's
being.
not
I
helpful.
think the Torah is smarter than you or better than you. Okay, and
For
therefore,
sure help. It's for sure helpful, but where we like where we get stuck over here is that it's not enough. Maybe we probably have to use an example to talk about this in a way that makes sense. Like, how did we get to here? I'm already forgot where I got here. We got here in this like, well, number one, like, so I'll go back to my halacha thing. If it would be a if we'll restrict the conversation in a very strict sense, like if I'm trying to make a very strict restricted, right, halachic argument, then I agree. It's even easy for me to say, right? It's easy for most people to say, I would tell you something different, but halacha is like this, right?
yeah,
And I could even maybe
yeah,
nothing wrong
halacha
with saying
definitely
that.
serves as a limit on thought and reason. Yes.
And we could say why the halacha disagrees with me. Okay,
Yeah.
maybe it's smarter than me, maybe because it's some people that were dumber than me that decided this and now we're stuck with them. You could say whatever you want. But
Maybe it's important to not do what you think is right
right,
sometimes.
and so on. Said it. But we could it's easy to get to that space. Almost nobody gets to that space in non-halachas conversations, right?
Mhm.
Almost nobody. I don't know anybody. Now I'm thinking about it.
Because people aren't articulating the fact that they're living under this
The
form of
Rambam is sometimes gets to this, like, and then of course he can't say it, so he plays around. That sometimes he gets to say some things like, "This is what the Torah believes." I'm not sure if I
So what
believe,
are like these inspirational
but
books? Like you have Ein Banim Samecha, right? So it's very inspiring to people. Like I don't know. What's the difference between that and my book?
and
Is it you have the same criticism on that book? Are you familiar with it?
didn't read it very. I
It's very
read,
different than
read a
mine
little bit,
because by the way, it's very different. A lot of the reasons that you're saying because mine is much trying to be much more formal and technical, and he's being openly inspirational and trying, you know, so that inspires people. And I'm trying to argue. I'm trying to make an argument, and he's trying to inspire. And I think that gets to the point you're making.
so yeah, so my question is like, if you're doing an like, I get the need. I'm in this problem with everything basically. Okay, like it's not just the you. It's the Jewish tradition all the way till the times of the Mishnah. At least maybe in the Nevi'im who are also making arguments of some sense and in the same way. Um, I have the same problem with them. Um, if you want to make an argument, in other words, if you want to talk to make an argument based on what I think, then do that. It's not so
Mhm.
hard because most people have very basic beliefs. You could
But that
work.
changed ever
Right?
since Moshe wrote his book. Now people care about more than just what you think.
Okay, if you want to do that, then I think that the only thing that works in that is the halacha one.
So why does the book have anything besides for halacha? That's the question then on you. Is it this? There's no purpose to that because
So
as
if you
long as
want to come to me and say like you are committed to this book, but your commitment will only make sense like this and like this.
yeah,
Um,
that's what I'm saying, right?
I,
And in
what
as
I
much as the book has preambles and not just laws, clearly,
I get it. I
there's
get the
more to it.
argument. What I feel like you're doing is like I don't know why I'm not touched by it.
No, so that's I think there must be
I
something
just not
specific
moved when you do
that's not
that.
convincing you. And that's what I think. I don't think you're making
I'm
this look
totally
weird.
not convinced.
No, I see that's the
And not
thing.
only me, I can see that there's a lot of people that are not convinced when you do that. Like I see many people. I'll tell you what I do see.
Well, because it's
Me,
easy to ignore. That's true. It takes a
why is
lot
it easy
more
to ignore? But why?
because it takes a lot of a buy-in. You have to look at the whole bigger picture. That's why I would like to get from you. I'd like to understand, well, what about it didn't convince you? Because you did read it a few times, so you do understand the bigger picture. And I want to know, well, what about it?
The bigger
And
picture of your book, but
yeah,
not.
yeah. In other words, because I think the reason why it's easy to ignore is only because you have to really, like I said, you have to come learn by me for a year to get the whole thing, and then I think you'll be convinced. And by the way, in terms of solving people's problems, I solved my own problem.
Right,
Like you're
right.
saying, I
So
didn't
very
solve
good.
people's problems. I solved my own problem. I made myself clear about something. So
Very
that's
good.
what I want to do to others also. And
Very good. I do think, and I do think personally for me or for other people that I know, this kind of work can solve people's problems sometimes. I think it's very hard for them to explain it to other people, maybe just because it takes a very long time.
That's what I'm wondering. Right. If it's just a matter
Um,
of it's complex and it's time.
Maybe. It must be much longer because you're talking about like the whole Torah, not just like about restricted to assuming a whole bunch of assumptions. Are you allowed to do this kind of work? Yes. But mm, also, so what I was thinking is that it can help people who have this kind of problem. In other words, I know many people, and I think even this is actually hard to explain. It's usually like a very long process. There are a bunch of people that I know. One of the people actually told me that he thinks that it's only a 15-minute conversation, and you convince it to everyone. But for some reason, it's very hard to have that 15-minute conversation.
What? Convince them of what?
Let's say this, of the political meaning of the Torah. Okay,
Ah, okay.
so without well with let's take out Israel, right? This like
Right.
basic
Okay.
thought, like when and I know many people who like Zionism is that at least an interpretation of that, right? I know so many people who are like brought up in this like, yeah, you just got to do this because that's what you got to do, and that's like either that's a thing which you either accept or don't, but there's nothing to do with it. And then someone showed them somehow a very simple thing, like, there's people, we have to have some kind of rules or ideas of how to live together and so on. And the Torah is something like that. And they're like, wow, right, this solves the problem for many people. Of course, it also creates its own problems, but okay. And especially, it doesn't solve the problem for many. By the way, this is one thing, but we should put that on the side. What it does to people who are who are brought up in our kind of yeshivas is that it usually makes them cynical or
Yeah.
makes them because we have this interpretation of the word political as cynical. Okay.
Right.
So just about controlling the masses and so
Right.
on, and
Right.
there's a problem.
Which,
But
of course,
besides,
when we were talking about political
yeah,
theology,
yeah,
not made in any cynical way, just to
right.
be
We understand this. I'm just saying
yeah,
this
yeah.
is a problem. It's a real problem. But okay. But let's say assume that we could explain this. Um, that solves people's problems. And like you said, then it's like, oh, so it doesn't make sense. There's a point. Now,
Right.
and in the same way as like, and if we go back, I don't, you mentioned his name, so I guess I'm allowed to. And like, Baruch Spinoza would have been a good Jew if there would have been the Zionist state, right?
Yeah.
Because his basic argument is with the Rambam and people who made Judaism into something more than that. And it's like, no, for more than that, I have philosophy. I don't need your book.
Right.
And it doesn't work. That was okay.
Right.
And you argue with that, right? You disagree.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but if the Torah just has a constitution for a people, it's a reasonable constitution. He doesn't even think it's a bad constitution,
Mhm.
and it just that doesn't exist that state. And now that we made it exist,
Yeah.
okay, we don't really make it exist. We made something
Right.
inspired by it somehow exist. Then he might have just become back a Jew, right?
Mhm.
Um, and I know some of my friends are in that situation.
Okay.
Um,
No, so that's not my position. There's this overlap there, but just to
I
be
get the difference, right? The difference is right, but it's also because you're not liberal. Like you don't. He has a very limited idea of what a state should be. Okay, but uh, we can get into all these
yeah. Okay.
chalikim. I'm just saying that this is what I'm trying to say here is just like if people have a specific personal problem, like this, just as halacha it doesn't make sense as a program for a state or something political program.
Society, maybe a safer
Yeah,
word.
society, it's maybe state is a bad word. So society, a community, even you want to say, okay,
Right.
it does make sense. And then we have, of course, a lot of questions, but that makes the whole thing make sense. And you solved my problem. That's something that makes sense. You don't do that in your book, right?
I
Not
do, but not
explicitly.
explicitly. Not explicitly.
Right. So maybe that's
Okay, I did it for myself, for me, and I think it solves for others if they'll study my book. I think, by the way, that's a big problem that the fact that it takes a lot of work, that itself is an issue. I think it minimizes the impact and maybe the shortcuts, but I don't know if it's a fundamental
so like
criticism.
if your book, I wonder if anyone wrote this book. I know people that like say this, they have this theology. Um, like did anyone write this book that says like why don't you write that book like because it would involve too many kashas in the first part. I'm not sure.
Which book? This what?
The
The one
book
that
that says like look at you've got a religion that makes no sense. I don't know how you explain that it makes no sense, but okay. um you got to use something for that, and look at my pshat, right?
well, the Ramban says it already. Knew that we're just keeping in practice. That's I think the Ramban. Lahavdil Spinoza. That's the thing. What do you mean? That's my answer.
Right. During the
No, I
Kuzri and
do
then
say
the
that.
Ramban and so on. And
Yeah,
of course the problem with the Ramban is that then we go on for another 1,000 years doing that thing that is just
because
a
we deny that, we
preparation.
ignore that because we're comfortable engaging with that. But I think that's the truth. I'm saying, and
Okay, okay, but so I'm not. This is a theory, like this is a proposal. I'm just saying nobody wrote that. The Ramban didn't write that book because even the Ramban, when he asked, like, he wrote that sometimes. Ramban was multifaceted. Sometimes he said things like that. Yeah, the Kuzri wrote that book. It's true. The Kuzri wrote that book. Um,
right, and that's you can't write that book without also writing in it. Go to Eretz Yisrael, and the Ramban didn't say everyone should go, so he didn't write that book. You can't. It will be the biggest avla to people. It's us
Rabbi
are going to
Levi
do.
wrote that book, although he also like sort of hid the questions. Like he didn't make it so explicit of how much it doesn't work otherwise. He makes it sound like it's just something you should cry about by the kidneys, but not like a real
Who you're referring to?
catastrophe. Rabbi Levi, right? Like
Yeah,
if you read Rabbi Levi, then most people would read it and say, okay, now I understand why there's kidneys on Tisha B'Av.
right.
But they wouldn't say, now I understand why, like at some point we should either cut our losses or try to do something because this is not working, right?
No, why wouldn't they say that? What do you mean? Of course they do. You do. No? People
Some
really don't
people,
realize
yeah,
that's what he
people,
did. That's what he did.
right.
Speaking of books that work for the author, right? I mean, that's the point. I think
It-
I think it works to himself and people can inhabit that same space. And you write a book that allows people to inhabit the same mental space that you did. That's a big chalice.
Okay, but why don't you do that? I thought that you don't do that because hmm,
I'm timid and shy. What do you mean?
it's
That's
not what you're
you
trying
know
to
why.
do. Because what I get the impression of you trying to do is more something like because I'll tell you why. Because
Because of the language thing. Okay, that's why you know that. You know why? Because I am trying to talk to people in their
very
language.
good. So you're trying so that you're back to like doing the stira where you're trying to convince someone that it's
No,
not,
but again, I don't
and
think
then
it's a
it's not
steer.
halacha.
Right, right. Because
I
I think
understand that it's not a stira, but it's still a difficulty at least, right? It's possible. There's a difficulty. Okay, I could tell you like a simple, like even assuming we could probably have the most simple reason why it's difficult is because most people, including so-called the Talmid Chachamim and so on, don't have the tools to deal with it, right? If someone
right.
wants
I
to
mean,
make
saying
an
you're telling me
argument,
to write a book of philosophy, but essentially political philosophy or something like that.
no, I don't know. I'm just saying that there would be a book that I would understand what it's doing. In my head, it would make sense. I don't know, say I would agree, but it would start with like a problem, like there's this religion, it doesn't work. It's a bunch of people mumbling words all day and shaking lulavs, whatever, and it's weird. And
No, no,
why
no.
don't we
Everything
do
works.
it?
Stop it. Stop. Everything works. Everything works.
Okay, let's
Yeah.
say if someone would have
Yeah.
that question, then
Right.
that's why we have a dialogue. There's some bad king has this question,
Oh, good.
and I'm not getting into this. It would be a whole different conversation. And then you could say, well, the answer is that we're not really just about mumbling words. It's really about this thing. And of course, then therefore we got to do it.
Mm-hmm.
That's a book that I would at least understand. It would totally make sense to me.
Right.
I could also easily argue. Like you could argue, well, the problem is bigger than your solution, doesn't actually
But
solve
no one
it.
would read that book except for you.
Or
That's why
you
I
could
didn't write it.
argue,
No one but for you would read that book. Like,
I think people have written this book. I mean, this is, you see, okay.
no, I'm talking to the entire world. Okay, I was getting to the same point. I'm trying to talk to the entire world.
I wonder, people have written this book in the sense of, none in the Torah world, you have to write it as a book of apologetics. And the problem with apologetics, that's not serious. It's like, okay, here's some more thoughts. Um, the people that have written these books are the Zionists, like,
Yeah. Yeah.
and the original Zionists. And the interesting thing with that is that, and this would be a question that you would have to answer in your book. I'm sure you would have an answer to it. But the interesting thing, well, depends on your framing. But the question that you would have to answer in that book would be something like, what about Basa B'chalav, right? You would get stuck on that a little bit. Maybe you could answer it, but you would have this question of like because I'll tell you why the proof for this being a question is just because those Zionists they sort of skipped the Basa B'chalav part, right?
Well, they're doing something very
Even the
different.
religious Zionists.
No, but that okay. I guess that's what you're saying. That's where my Torah comes in. I mean, the fact that I'm working with the Torah. Is that what you're getting at?
No, I'm saying yeah. I guess there's a
I'm
question,
trying to
and
see how that integrates. That's your question. That's what you're
I
pushing.
guess there's a question, and I'm not sure.
I
I don't know
hear.
what your answer to that would be. Like even
Well,
the religious Zionists sort of have to do a reduction of the Torah of many aspects of it for the work this thing to work.
yeah, listen, okay. I'm advocating for a religious politics in a way that's very different than anything that's been tried till now, in my opinion. So I think in order to really address your question, we really have to go into my thinking of what Arecha means, which is the title of the book, and what hasn't really been tried yet by a community and what I'm really interested in. So, and then the Torah is all downstream from that. Like we're talking about this, but we never really got into what it is. So I don't think we're being so fair here. You know,
I get
I'm
it. I
not
get
saying
it.
it's a constitution. I'm not saying that the halacha is just a constitution. You know that.
I get it.
Um,
I'm just saying that that's something. I don't know if your book does it even. Like maybe you did only a little bit of it, and
okay,
you have to write a whole other
I see.
lot more
Okay,
details. And
got it.
also,
Right,
yeah,
but that's what's called Kula. That's a thing. Like,
of course. Said
no, like I'm inviting people to learn Kol Kula with me. That's really what I'm doing, and it's anchored by Eretz Yisrael.
the
I
other
can't.
question that I would have would be something like, I'm not question. The difficulty maybe that I'm articulating is that when you make such an argument, it can, even if you make this argument, so the easy way to do it would be this way, like just that would work even for like Amaratzim, right? But you'd still have to answer these questions, which maybe not is very hard to answer for Amaratzim. Like, so therefore, what about the Basa B'chalav? Even the Ramban seems to have a difficulty with this. Like, it tries to this whole Tzionim thing sort of devalues Basa B'chalav, or at least some of it, and we get into Mitzvah Tlis B'aretz, and those mitzvahs mean something. And of course, all Hilchas said Roim is not that, at least not the way it's practiced, even by the people that the things that we practice. You would have to talk about Shemitah as some kind of real system and so on, right?
I don't
Uh,
know. I'm not sure about that.
I'm just giving ideas. I don't know.
Hmm.
Um, um, but besides for that, but that's something that could work. If you're making it as an argument of um, if the but the way you framed it before was more like, since you're committed to this book, it has to have a meaning, and this is the meaning, and you also want to show we have sukkim and so on sources for this kind of meaning. Um, so I know this is maybe where actually the real reason why I'm like I'm going to tell you something from like my chinuch, right? Maybe it's not serious, but um uh the real thing that I get from the part 7 of your book is that uh the way I was trained and is like there's two kinds of people. Um I'll tell you a story, not a personal story. Like a friend of mine told me that he read not he read, Rabbi Orbach read one of Rabbi Shmuel Zalman's children read a mama from Rav Hutner or someone like that. It was about Tisha B'Av, not Tisha B'Av, but Yom Kippur, a nice mama. And the mama finished, and whoever doesn't understand this never fasted Tisha B'Av in his life. Some kind of flourish like that. And he said, "Why? I get your Dvar Torah, but like, I think everyone else also did Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur. Like, you're right."
Right.
This is the attitude, and you could see this attitude like someone that I know, like he was set up a drusha once by on Purim about Amalek. What does Amalek mean? And then someone came to him and said, "What do you mean? You said this, but I have an eye that's like that." And he told me that he didn't understand what the guy wanted. Okay, so you want to say that? Say that. Like it's a Torah that's in the good in that, but move on. And it seems like this is a basic classic problem of Aguda, right? That seems like it's very hard to be serious in it. And if you want me to give like a theory of why this is, the answer would be something related to this, that halacha has this system for particularizing questions very well. We get to a very specific detail, which is sort of easy to answer, like how many strings does this need? Okay, we could answer that. In order to have an answer of like what is the idea of Amalek, you would have to answer the whole Torah, and therefore you would have to know the whole Torah for one. And nobody does. Nobody knows the whole Torah. Nobody even knows like the whole Chumash or the whole Tanakh. Very few people. Maybe you, because you went to the Chumash. What's it called?
You don't. Yeah.
Yeah, no, seriously. But if people like
How did the Bali Agada decide what to say? I'm not going to go. How did the Nevi'im decide what they say? Because I don't want to push that. But how did the Shmuel ben Achmeni, the Bali Agada, always know put what to say? So I'm
right,
not going to claim I'm a Navi, but I'm going to claim that I get what Chazal were doing with Agada. And yes, I agree with you. Most people don't. And that's why most people say Drushis are just saying, Kenzog Nazai, Kenzog Nazai. But there are some people, see, go back to a Footner, I think he was probably wrong. But if you go back to him and say, oh, what do you mean I didn't get it? He would say, no, you really didn't get it because this is what it's about. I discovered it and no one knew till now. And like, that's possible. You might disagree
right,
with him. And I would probably agree with you that he's wrong, but I don't agree that it can't be. I
it
think
could
these
be.
probably are deep things. True Amuna is like this close to Kfir, right? Every idea is wrong except for one. So everyone else is just better. They should have been a kaifer. And there's one guy who got the idea, right? Meaning, let's say you have the wrong idea of Eretz Yisrael.
I get it.
So
So
good. So you like the anti-Zionist.
at least when I tell you this story, it's at least that like traditionally people, at least people that are trained in halacha for the most part, just don't take seriously agadic arguments, and there's a reason for that. Even if you could say, well, they're wrong, or you could say, well, they're right at least for themselves, right? Because they don't have the tools. The Chazon Ish famously says in Amid B'tochen, like, Bali Agada, yeah, first know the whole Tanakh and all the Mamori Agada, and then we'll talk to you.
Correct.
And obviously, you have to do.
Basically, he's saying, what?
I agree with his argument. Like,
I agree with
otherwise,
it descriptively that most people, 99, whatever, and even Talmidei Chachamim have no idea what Agada is or how to go about it, what its rules are, what the parameters are.
so
And that's what taking Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, he was clearly a master of Agada in ways he doesn't even make it clear, but he's calling on Midrashim, working with the Midrashim, saying pshatim and diukim and gemaras and Agadas that are really good if you learn it properly. So I don't think it's impossible. I think it's very rare. And I think it's been unlike halacha. See, in halacha, you got to get it right, or you're saying shtusim mitlakshin, right? In Agada, you have people get up and say whatever they want, and no one realizes that there's a possibility of something more rigorous. But there is. And I'm
right,
doing that in my Tanakh studies and in the Sefer.
right, but
So yeah,
you at
I'm
least
like
are
a voter. I'm
lacking.
saying you don't get it. If you don't get it, if you don't
So
understand it.
so you're at least lacking an audience that can evaluate it.
Right. Right.
Because, and this is important not only besides, even if you would be 100% right, which of course, according to you, you are, and according to other people, maybe not, uh, even like when you're making this kind of argument, you're going to have a problem because I noticed this problem in many different areas. Like, if there's only three people in the world that even have the background to evaluate it,
Hmm.
and how you can convince people that don't really have the background that are just going to take your own authority, but you
Hmm.
can't convince anyone, and then that's also a problem for you
Yeah. So where
because
does this lead us? Where does this lead us? Right.
it leads us to a problem.
I know, but like it's a problem I experienced personally. Like I'm just saying, there's a certain loneliness in this endeavor, which is you're describing it. That like there's very few people I share the language with. But like what am I supposed to do?
I don't
What's a
know what
partner
to
supposed to
do.
do?
I actually think that this is a real problem. There's also a problem where because of that, it's very hard to get valuable feedback, right? It's easy to make Hasidim or Misnagdim. Those
Right.
things are not Chachma. But to get
Right.
feedback that's worth anything is
Right.
not simple because you only have three people, and most of those three people are already jaded and they're like nobody understands. They don't want to talk to you even. That's also been my experience when I tried to get such feedback from people that I know something, and I told him, "Could you tell me?" And he like didn't take me seriously because like
Mm.
the guy living 60 years, nobody actually ever take anything seriously about this. So like, yeah, whatever. But it means that even my thoughts are going to be pretty not worked out, or at least they're going to be somewhat kherval about them because of
Mhm.
the solution is to talk with me, of course. That's
Of
all
course. That's what we're doing. Right.
this thing.
Right. So
And
that,
if
but
we're
that's
missing
why.
background, we'll go back. We'll read Tanakh again and all
Right. So no,
Hashem
I need
again.
substantive criticism. I need specific substantive criticism. That's the thing. Like I want
I
to know
get
where
it.
you're not convinced. That's
I
what I'm
get
still
it.
waiting.
That's the problem.
That's what I need to hear. And that's very
We didn't
valuable,
get
of
to that.
course.
We didn't get to that.
Right.
I get that's where we. I guess that's where we need to get. Uh,
No,
and
I
you,
think there's a very interesting point, by the way. No, I think there's an interesting point which relates to the fact, like, how should we be writing books? This is something I think about a lot. You could teach to writing a book. For things like this, there's probably a much better method of teaching, which is living. Like living a certain way, you can teach people things that you can teach much more effectively than writing. And I think this is the kind of thing that if I can embody it somehow, like all the ideas, I think that may have been may perhaps a more interesting endeavor. I think that's something to think about. Like what kinds of chachmas are taught best in books as opposed to
Hmm.
practice, let's say.
So everything I was thinking about, maybe this is the same thing as what I'm thinking. There's. I was thinking that like practice is also a practice of learning. Like that's also a living thing. And
Right.
for example, if you go in yeshiva, mm, but in yeshiva they don't really teach you anything. They teach you a way of living. That's what when they say it, they say we teach you how to learn, but not learning. But what it really is like a certain relation to a text. What kind, like what they say in Brisk, what kind of things are absolute, what kind of surahs are you don't say. That's more important than what you do say. Um, and that somehow, not always, but somehow can get taught even without all the background, right? To judge if Reb Chaim Brisker's pshat in the Rambam is correct, you have to know the whole Rambam. And no Bacher in yeshiva has the tools to do that. But the yeshiva system after a few generations of that, managed to teach Bachrim and maybe a little older people to like at least have the kind of like I don't know, like maybe heuristics or like some kind of feelings of like they could right away notice and they ask good questions. Even if you talk to small bachram, if they listen to their Maggid Shir and they know the raid, they'll
Mm,
ask you the correct questions and they'll be able to tell you when you're wrong. Even if you're much
right.
smarter, you have much more background, and maybe you could make the case for some all totally different thing. But at least according to this structure, this framework, they're gonna give you good answers. And I feel like that might be something that could be done. I don't personally.
Wait, so you're saying something like, let's say, open abyss managers where we study this, and then it becomes the siach and the way
Yes,
of thinking.
according to
Yeah,
a certain, like
yeah,
according to
okay,
us, even according to what your mahalach is or whatever, according to a
right, right, right.
certain thing. But I have very little experience in this because I think that it's taking me until tomorrow to like be able to judge something. Like we're so used to just talking on authority, like learning things on authority all the time, and like I'm studying the Moreh Nevuchim in this. I have a weekly class for 3 4 years now, and like the ideal place to be would be to be able to like, and it's very easy to ask questions on him. Well, your pshat doesn't make sense. The pasuk doesn't obviously doesn't say that. The medrash, but of course, in the Rambam said it's not that it didn't. He knew that he wasn't lying. This is a very easy way out, right? He's just using it. He really thought that it says this, and it was based on he learned the whole Torah and the whole philosophy and everything, and it made sense to him. And there was something that didn't make sense, like the big proof of the Rambam not just making stuff up is that he on certain mitzvahs he says I don't understand that. That's like wait, you had actually a criteria until now. You weren't just like making stuff up. Wow, what's going on? Right?
Yeah, well,
What?
there's also the reading that
I
he's
know
making that
there's
doesn't
conspiracy
understand
theories about
it.
that. Yeah, I know. I even yeah, but at least shows you that there's something
Of course.
going
No,
on.
no, for sure. Yeah, I agree with you.
Um, and it's very hard to get. Like, and people do the same thing with Chazal and the Psukim, right? Obviously, they just no. And you study for 30 years, maybe you'll figure out. Wait, this is what works. This is what doesn't work. Maybe here I can
Mm,
disagree with them even, but
mm,
within their structure, I don't. I'm very far from this, from being able to do this for anything. Um,
mm.
it's probably yeah, it's a life work, and it's and
Right.
according
I
to
think what
you,
you're
even
saying
that
is
would
you
only be the step one because then we have to do it. So
right. No, so I think what you're saying is Talmud Torah is made with Maisa in all sorts of interesting ways, and sometimes it could take 50 years. I think that's essentially to distill what you're saying. You're saying it's not always so linear. In other words, when halacha, okay, chayiv potter, the pasuk says chayiv. A, you're mekayim mitzvahs Talmud Torah because he said chayiv, and B, you know exactly what to do because you go do it. But there's also a kind of Talmud Torah that works in more subtle ways and takes longer to have its
like
effect.
I'm very curious about interested in like the criteria. What's the criteria for a correct psak? Right? What's the criteria for a correct? You made an argument. By what do we judge it? Right? The fact that it's a nice drasha, okay, that's not enough, obviously. So what is the criteria? There has to be some criteria, and to know the criteria seems to be the biggest problem. We
Right.
don't.
Right. So what's interesting to me, and this gets what I was saying before, is that I think there's something to think about, which is that there's certain criteria, like if we're going to live under the Torah, right? So there's some malleability, right? Obviously. You could say your way, you could say my way. So how do we know what's better? One way to think about it is that which um all the adherents of the Torah are going to eventually tend towards. So the way of thinking that's more unifying and unifiable is the better one. So then if someone discovers a truer Pshat in Torah, such as I believe I did, I put it out there because I think that it might take 100, 200 years, but everyone's going to get there. Everyone's going to be living like me. And Rotner thinks the same thing about Tisha B'Av. He thinks eventually everyone's going to realize this. So that's a better psak, and it's a better way of thinking because, in as much as the Torah is the way of thinking for everyone, something which is where everyone's going to tend towards
Right,
is
but
better
how
even today.
the main important question is like how much of it is going to be based on authority. Like I actually think of Hutner as a great success because a lot of his thoughts became like commonplace. Everyone thinks what he
Right,
thought,
right,
and but he didn't actually convince anyone on his level ever of anything.
right, right.
This is the
Made
same. We
Chassidim
discussed this
wonder.
last time.
Yeah,
But
made
of course,
Chassidim.
and even I don't know. I wonder, but like even some of the good thoughts that he has, okay, they're convincing because they work. But also, even like it's not Hasidim. If someone who's like from a different base medrash comes and says, "Ah, Rav Hutner said," so I take it seriously. Uh, but that's not. I mean, that's true. That's a good way of learning because he's probably smarter than most people
Right.
reading him. But it's still not. It doesn't prove to me like there's no peer review, right? There's no.
Right, right. But that's
We're
sort of
still
how it
missing.
goes. You write a book, you're an authority, you're somebody, and like the Rambam writes about that. Something's in a book, everyone takes it seriously. That's how it goes, right? No, that's the purpose of writing a book. That's why I should walk around and make sure I look very chashuv, like chushuv yid, because that way my book will be effective.
That's true, but also we should try to do this thing where we didn't we was very meta everything still, but
I know.
we should try to like figure out how we could even like have this discussion. And maybe it's impossible. This is the problem because like when you talk to me, you have to at least trust. For example, you have to trust that I read. Maybe I didn't, or maybe I did, or maybe I did the wrong books. Like you want to tell me an argument of what the point of the whole Torah is? I don't know. I never read the whole Torah. Okay, I sort of did 1.5 times because I made this project of reading the whole thing, and like I hope I didn't miss a few psukim. I have no idea. Like okay, but most people didn't even do that, right?
Yeah,
So
okay. So what? I don't think you have
very
to read the whole time. Who cares? You
no,
read
you
you read
do,
the important stuff, you know?
but that's everyone
No, I'm saying if there's places where the Torah
tries to
says
read
the main
important
points, it's
stuff.
clearly places where the Torah is making the main points. You get the main points. Either
Okay,
Pirusha.
okay.
What do you mean? That's the
Those
guy you
are
want on 1 foot. On one
we
foot.
do that based that, but that's also on authority. Like we know that these are the important stuff because we were told because
No, we
people.
know Vayem Hashem Alavam Lech Lecha is clearly important. Then my book is coming to be Mamad Torah Regalachas and show how
Okay, we could discuss that. Okay, that's the discussion. I really don't know how if I could like could I have a good discussion with you about if Lech Lecha are more important than Vayerda? I don't know. Whatever. I don't know.
why not? Why not? Why not? That's what I'm
I
trying.
don't know. I feel like it would be maybe we should try next week or next month and see what happens. Like
Mhm.
just if we like just
But doesn't everyone do this? Just everyone knows, everyone has the important parts of the Torah, right? Like they think
yeah,
this is
for sure.
so,
In
and
order
there's
to
got to be some
decide,
criteria by which that's determined. So I'm not sure what your question is.
I guess, but in order for me to know that that's correct, I would have to read the whole thing, right? Or like most of it.
You could trust 1,000 years, like no one ever quoted Eve, so probably it's not so important. Whatever.
No, I think that Eve is the most important one, and
I
actually,
know,
that
I
some
know.
of the people that I
Bad
read
choice.
do quote him. Nobody quoted
What?
Divrei Yamim. That's true. But there's a list in Sefer of which parts of the Tanakh get quoted.
Oh
Like
yeah.
their chart.
Uh,
They have like a
uh,
database
uh,
for Talmud for you could see which
nice.
psukim the Gemara likes the most.
Speaking of, someone once told me I met this guy at the Chidon, I forgot his name. He told me he was doing this analysis of which parties in Israel quoted which Nevi'im. Isn't that interesting? To show, the Labor Party, they're always quoting whatever, how the different ideas are rooted in different Nevi'im.
So that's the problem. At least one of the problems. I think we discussed two problems today. One is the problem
Yeah.
of like this middle kind of convincing,
Yeah, that wasn't very interesting
which
for
seems
me.
to
I
be
learned
very
something
kind of
from it.
hard,
Yeah.
and you're not the only one having this difficulty. And the second is the basic I got problem of convincing people in like Agada, where there's the problem of the criterion, at least the problem that even if the you
No,
know
but like, doesn't that mean again, yeah, that's I think the two things. But doesn't just that mean that we don't have criteria of how to learn Haggadah? So maybe we should start at
could
school,
be
like how to learn Haggadah.
even if well, so there's two questions. One is there such a thing? Miki Abraham wrote a book claiming that there isn't such a thing.
Yeah.
Did you read his book? You know what I'm
No, I
talking
didn't read
about. There's a
it. I
book,
didn't read it.
but you know that he wrote
Yeah,
there's such
yeah,
a
yeah.
book. Yeah. I'm proud. It's probably wrong, but
Mm,
he's smart and he has good arguments usually. Actually, that exact argument is one of his weaker points. But in any case,
okay.
like, and it's based on this like empirical reality where like for 1,000 years or more, everyone is just saying what they want and like telling us
I
that,
know. Why
and
can't there be a
including
flaw?
the
Why can't
grizzly.
there be a chassan,
I don't think it's a doesn't disprove anything because there could be a machlokes, one of them could be right,
Right.
but or partially right.
No, but there was much more than that. It was people were just saying whatever they wanted. It wasn't
No,
people
but
didn't
even the
say
people that you
anything.
take seriously very have this issue because there's like very few things that are because there's like we discussed in the beginning there's very few things that seem to be accepted on everyone.
I know, but there are things that are compelling. What should I tell you? I believe that. I guess we have to pick something, and like,
That's
I
then
actually do
that would
believe
be
that.
an internal discussion, like a internal to third discussion. But
Right.
at least we have the problem of nobody having this, and we discussed how we might. Are there but the medrash where there's like criteria for this? I feel like the main play again, if there's criteria, it's authority. Like the Rebbe never said such titles, so you shouldn't say them either. Okay.
I have to make myself a rebel, which I knew this already. I mean, that's the muskan over here. Like,
No, I'm the whole time trying to get away from that maskana. That's the whole thing.
but that's
Of
what you
course,
just
that
said.
works. No, but that doesn't give us actual bikoret, right? That doesn't actually
No,
give us a
it
besmedrash,
does. Well,
which
no, I
because there's
mean, not a
nobody that can
bikoret.
argue with you. Because
Right.
I this is like my one of my biggest problems ever. is like my biggest things, and maybe there's no solution to it, but I hope there is that all the people teaching Jewish thought or seem to just each turn into a person that you either believe or disbelieve, and they don't talk with each other almost. Unlike like the Rishonim talk to each other, right? The Ramban and
Right.
the Rambam, even if they're coming from very different paradigms, and most of the time their arguments don't make any sense because they don't understand
Yeah.
each other.
They're talking past each other and something. Yeah.
They're talking past each other, but they still have a discussion. Like,
Mhm.
and we could go through
Yeah.
it and see, okay, so this is how you organize the
Right.
psukim, this is how
Right.
you organize it. That doesn't happen anymore.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
and that probably makes everyone worse. Like, not only the problem of the one right person doesn't get to convince everyone, even the people like we're not making progress.
Right.
And this is why I talk with you because we should at least. I might, even though it's dangerous, I might get convinced and become a Zionist one day. You never know. But like otherwise,
Well,
like,
I was coming in hoping you were going to convince me to be an
well, we didn't
Azion.
actually talk about the actual subject yet. We just talked about how we're going to convince each other. So
Right.
maybe we'll get to it.
Okay, good.
Uh, I guess that's the, which would be much more interesting, the actual subject. But
Right.
we're, we just started talking about this thing about like if the halacha way, yeah,
Yeah.
the beginning.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that that was a nice conversation. I hope
I think so too. It was clarifying for me.
so. Okay. So um, we did that. We could try to continue next time and see if we could like talk if Lech Lecha is really the most important pasuk or something.
You could do that.
I have no idea how I do it though, but,
Yeah, I want to think about which of the aspects we touched on are
or
the most
something like that.
important. What? I want to think about that. Like which are the most interesting to explore. Let's see.
Okay. Okay, so thank you so much. Well,
Thank you. Thank you, Ritz. It was great.
yes, thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Bye bye.